Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat and you're watching the 10th and final episode of the Last of Us Could Have Been Very Different series, where we reconstruct and discuss one of the original storyboards from the game's development. If you came across this video while browsing or something, I'd strongly recommend that you watch the series in chronological order, because well, otherwise it most likely won't make a lot of sense. Anyways, in this episode, old headaches reappear, as our characters make their way west. So let's not delay any further.
Let's get on with it.
As the sun rose, the chase had been going on for hours. Strangely enough, none of the bikes nor the cars had caught up. And even more strange was that they hadn't fired off a single shot at them. Tess was probably waiting for him to run out of gas to then torture him, he figured. According to the road signs, they were getting very close to San Francisco. But that didn't matter as long as there were several bloodthirsty hunters and bandits on their tail. He couldn't wait for the gas to run out. Then, he'd just be a sitting duck. He had to outmaneuver Tess and quickly find somewhere to make a stand. After a few more minutes, he saw something that might be good for doing just that. An old, barely standing wooden sign said something about a nearby farm at the next exit. Joel waited until the very last moment before hastily turning, making Tess overshooting quite a lot on the highway. As he turned, he could feel the car almost flipping over. He continued driving as fast as he could on the bumpy, overgrown gravel road leading toward the farm. 1 or 2 minutes later, he could see the house, and as if she knew, Ellie woke up immediately, like one would do from a nightmare. Joel stopped the car in front of the house. Ellie, looking back toward the caravan of hunters coming towards them, nervously asked what was happening. But Joel had no time to tell her. If he was going to die here, at least he had to make sure Ellie lived. So he put a pistol in her hand and pointed toward the direction of San Francisco and told her to run as fast as she could and not look back. Ellie had tears in her eyes and tried staying, but Joel shouted and forced her to go. He grabbed a shotgun that had been in the trunk of the car and hurried inside the house, closing the door behind him. He threw as much furniture as he could in front of the door until heading to the second floor, where he positioned himself in a sniper's position in a window. A few seconds later, at least a dozen vehicles parked themselves below him. Tess stepped out of one of the cars and looked up at Joel. She said that it was a shame how they parted last time. Joel didn't respond. Tess continued by saying that she was going to finish the job this time, slow and painfully, just like she did with his brother. Joel felt the anger building up, but knew she was trying to make him do something stupid to humiliate him before she finished him off. A hunter voice shouted in the background and asked why she didn't just shoot him. Tess hissed at him to shut up, and as she was about to continue talking, another suggested they just burn down the house. Not pleased with getting interrupted once again, she fired off a shot in the man's leg. She continued and said that she didn't really care if she lived or died afterwards, only that she got her revenge for what he'd done to her in Boston. Getting tired of prolonging the situation, Joel popped out of his cover and fired off a few shotgun shells toward the small crowd, pellets spreading and hitting almost all of them. Tess tried to stop her men from doing something, but it was too late. Everyone began firing their weapons, blasting hundreds of holes into the wall. Joel had to retreat to the far side of the house. He vaguely heard Tess shouting at her men to not kill him before she presumably started pushing the door open. If he'd only have a nail bomb right now, and he might have gotten away. He aimed his revolver at the door to fire at anyone who came through. After a final push, the door burst open and Joel fired off a shot. A hunter dropped dead. Before he could react, Tess ran into the frame, throwing what seemed to be some sort of smoke bomb. He couldn't really move out of the way, since then he'd get hit by the hunters still firing at the walls in front of him. So he simply pulled up his shirt over his face in hopes of minimizing the effects. But it was no use. Once it went off, itchy smoke got into his eyes and lungs, stunning him for a little while. Unfortunately, that was all the time Tess needed to rush up the stairs and knock him down to the floor. As the air got breathable again, Joel could feel Tess tying his hands up behind his back. Whatever she'd do to him was worth it, as long as Ellie got away, Joel thought, as two hunters grabbed his legs and started dragging him down the stairs. After a few of the men had kicked and beaten him for a couple of minutes, Tess ordered them to tie him to a chair. Joel was bleeding at more places than he cared to count, but he wasn't going to give either the hunters nor Tess the satisfaction of showing his suffering. He was quiet and planned to stay that way until the sadistic excuses for human beings killed him. Tess put a chair in front of him and sat down, and at first just stared at him with a weird smirk on her face. After a few minutes, she pulled out a serrated combat knife from her belt and started playing with it for a few minutes before dragging it in long lines down Joel's legs, but careful not to create severe enough wounds to make him bleed out. After a while, she switched to his arms and then back to just watching him again. Joel still didn't budge. After shooting the smug scientist, as Joel was unplugging all the machines from Ellie to get her out of the hospital, one of the other two terrified scientists ran to the wall and hit the alarm button. Joel didn't care. He was going to get out with Ellie alive. That was all that mattered. What happened next, as long as they survived, was of no importance. The alarm was coupled with bright red lights illuminating the corridors, making stealth practically impossible. A lot of the fireflies were still downstairs after the scaffolding collapse, making dodging the ones that were in his way easier. They didn't fire upon him out of fear of hitting Ellie and ruining their chances of producing a vaccine. But as Joel got closer to the garage elevator, some, in sheer desperation, did so anyways. Joel was grazed by a bullet in his left arm, but didn't feel it until much later when the adrenaline rush wore off. The final sprint toward the open elevator doors was like running in complete slow motion. It was almost like an out-of-body experience for Joel. His whole existence in that moment was consumed by getting Ellie out of there. After a few steps, almost seeming like walking on the moon in low gravity, he finally entered the elevator and pushed a button, right before the fireflies caught up. Half a minute passed until a ding sound indicating arrival resounded. Seeing the garage after exiting the elevator was strange. Ellie had run for as long as she possibly could before risking to collapse without even glancing back once. She had to slow down, but as she did, the sound of the wind whizzing past her ears and her heavy breathing and heartbeat no longer muffled the sounds of the gunfire, and she almost involuntarily turned around. Off in the distance was the farmhouse. A small plume of smoke was rising out of one of the windows, and the shooting was getting more infrequent by the second. Ellie felt her heart sink. Was Joel dead? She felt her legs shaking, but didn't know if it was because of the entire situation, or simply exhaustion. The odd shot still went off in the distance, and Ellie couldn't get the picture of a band of murdering hunters, spitting, shooting and mutilating Joel's dead body, for fun, out of her head. On the one hand, she knew Joel must have gone to extreme lengths to get her out alive, and would not want risking her life going back. But on the other, she couldn't let her only family left either get killed, or if the worst had happened, humiliated like that. Knowing she'd only fired a gun a few times before and only once at the live target, and was drastically outnumbered, she clenched her pistol tightly and made her way back toward the farm over the field she'd just crossed as fast as her body allowed it. A few minutes later, she arrived outside the house. Carefully glancing in through the window, from an angle she saw Joel tied to a chair, all bloody in front of that Tess that had been chasing them ever since they left Boston. Sneaking around to the front where Joel had stopped the car, and where there now was multiple other vehicles parked, Ellie looked around for anything to cause a distraction with. After opening a few bags on the sides of the motorcycles, she found a small white ball with a fuse. She didn't know what it was, but if she could ignite it and throw it in the other part of the house, maybe she could cause enough damage and distraction to be able to get Joel out. She searched around some more for a means of creating fire until she found a lighter in the glove compartment of one of the cars. She made sure it worked before sneaking around to the opposite side of the house to where Joel was tied up. Hunters and bandits were everywhere in the house, so it was impossible to get them all at the same time. But she found one window where there were at least 4 standing, just next to it inside. She lit the ball and threw it through the glass. She heard confusion and swear words and more rushing into the room to check what happened, until about 20 seconds later when the little ball went up into smoke that engulfed that entire side of the house, stunning several hunters in the process. Ellie hurried back to the window where Joel was and saw that Tess had stood up from her chair. Ellie thought she was going to check what happened as well, but to her dismay she approached the window. There was nowhere to hide. But as if acting on autopilot, just as Tess noticed her and tried drawing her weapon, Ellie fired off a shot, hitting Tess in the throat, making her fall down on the floor and out of sight. Ellie let out a shiver over what she'd just done, standing still on the spot. She almost wanted to just drop the gun and lay down, before realizing that she had to get Joel out before the hunters regained their orientation. She rushed in through the main doorway, hoping Joel was still alive and able to get out. When she entered the room, she saw Tess on the floor, lying in a big pool of blood, and she almost wanted to throw up, but she didn't. Joel looked up at her and asked if she did that. Ellie said she did. She went up to him to get the ropes off. What Tess had done to him was truly sadistic. There were long, clean cuts along his legs, arms and stomach, but they didn't seem deep enough to keep Joel from surviving. After pulling the knot for a few seconds, she got the ropes off, and the two ran out as fast as they could. They could hear loud voices behind them in the house, but didn't turn around to even try fighting. They had survived. As they jogged across the field in the direction Ellie had previously gone, Joel turned to Ellie and said that he had told her to run and not turn back. And Ellie turned to him and asked if he was glad she didn't, to which Joel chuckled and said he sure as hell was. After crossing the entire field and reaching the road again, they slowed down to walking instead. It was midday and a nearby sign said San Francisco was only a few miles away. Joel said they could make it there by sunset if they kept walking, and Ellie looked at him and chirped that she couldn't wait to see the west coast as soon as possible. So the pair continued walking. Hours later, they were walking up a hillside littered with ruins of old luxurious homes. Ellie complained about having to walk upwards, and Joel jokingly agreed. The sun had just set behind the peak of the hill, leaving them in temporary darkness, but not for long. A few short minutes later, they reached the top, and it was a view to behold. Before them was the vast ruins of San Francisco. Off in the distance was the overgrown but mostly intact downtown with its majestic skyscrapers as monuments from a lost age. Ellie stood taking it all in and turned to Joel and simply and slowly said, "Wow." Joel put his hand on her shoulder and asked if it was everything she'd hoped for. Ellie smiled and told him that the jury was still out, but that she couldn't deny the view. Man, that was one hell of a journey, wasn't it? Let's go for a discussion one final time for the series, shall we? The first thing that came to mind when writing this was how weird the lab flashback seems in this version of the story. Of course, it's stated very simply here, and there was most likely a lot more thought behind it. But as we see it, the concept of just a flashback to the lab after the main Firefly quote-unquote villain has been killed and without Marlene feels kinda pointless? I mean, the one we do get in the actual game is really powerful and neatly ties up that part of the story with the death of Marlene. But what does it do here? I really had a hard time trying to figure out what to even write for it. And what I did write isn't that good because it doesn't tie up any loose ends, plots or stories at all. It's just a pointless showcase of Joel's escape in more detail. And to me, that just feels like unnecessary over-explanation. Of course, it isn't fair for me to paint a picture for someone else and then critique that someone else over my own picture. I have no idea what they planned for that scene. It just says lab flashback. It could mean anything. Maybe even something from Ellie's perspective. Who knows? But what I'm saying is, from where I'm standing, it just doesn't make any sense for the previously mentioned reasons. What I'm also wondering is if this final sequence would be played from Ellie's perspective. I mean, it has to be that way, right? Sure, Joel makes a stand, but it says he gets captured, and that doesn't really make for the greatest gameplay now, does it? It might actually have played out like a reversed Ellie versus David scenario, with Joel in Ellie's place. Man, that could have been really cool. Another interesting question that's relevant for this, but also the entire storyboard, is how much of the stuff on it is supposed to be showcased through cutscenes, and how much is supposed to be part of the gameplay. I mean, The Last of Us is a very cutscene heavy game. If you take 15 hours to complete it, around 20% of that total playtime would be just watching cutscenes. So that might actually be a reason for these vague post-its, like the lab flashback, because they were supposed to be gameplay and couldn't be detailed more than that. But specific scenes that they knew how they wanted them to play out are cluttered with post-its instead, like at the very end there when Ellie kills Tess. That seems like a typical cutscene, to be honest. So what I said just now about playing as Ellie might not actually make sense at all. Talking a bit about the ending itself, I have mixed feelings about it. It's definitely more explosive than the one we got, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better. On the one hand, I would probably pass out in amazement over seeing the entire post-apocalyptic San Francisco cityscape. But on the other hand, is it really that great to leave Ellie's defining moment right at the very end? I mean, that feels like a huge waste of her character, which Naughty Dog definitely noticed since they have specifically talked about how they realized how bad of an idea having Ellie be passive, fragile and well, useless as an NPC companion was. Not to say a character like that cannot work. Take Clementine in The Walking Dead Season 1 for example. But she has a completely different purpose in that story. Beside that, I also don't really like there being a final boss fight. Even if it turns out that that was a cutscene, there was still that cliché final confrontation with the big bad villain. No, I definitely prefer the bittersweetness of the lie than a heroic last battle.
Though I'd seriously give all that up just to get the San Francisco part.
Speaking of big bad villains, let's talk a bit about that, because that is probably the single biggest difference from the actual game. We constantly have Tess, this, at least I assume, vengeful villain on our tail throughout the entire story, killing all our friends and other support characters along the way. But also, of course, narrowly missing out on killing our main character at the standard regular encounters until being defeated in the inevitable final boss battle. It's been done to death 1,000 times before in every genre of games. It almost reminds me a bit of the Far Cry games, the way they structured it with the villain introduction and the odd encounter until the end. The point is that having this villain, to me, doesn't really add anything to the game besides more gameplay opportunities, and acting as a device to force the characters to move. But as we can see in the actual game, that works perfectly well without a villain too. It would have been one thing if the entire game was centered around Joel and Tess's relationship, and then the fight for revenge. But Tess doesn't really, from how I interpreted the storyboard at least, even have a connection to Ellie, the second main character. So we have this split between the actual objective of getting the cure for mankind to the Fireflies, and another, really practically unrelated, revenge plotline. All at the same time as the actual point of the game is to focus on the relationship between Joel and Ellie. See my point here, guys? All this does for me is to take away from the grayness of good and bad with both characters and factions, because the game outright tells us who the villain is, and cluttering the story with distractions, only really taking away from the real goal of the relationship between Joel and Ellie. That isn't to say that you can't have multiple storylines in one game at the same time, but I don't think it fits here. In conclusion, removing the villain was a good choice in my opinion. I've already discussed how and why I dislike more seasons and all the supporting characters getting killed off in previous episodes, so I won't do that here. The last specific interesting thing here is that the infected are actually never mentioned once throughout the entire storyboard. Sure, the doctor gets bitten and the very first scene is a man getting infected. But other than that, nothing. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I think the simple reason for that is because first, Naughty Dog didn't even want to have infected in the game. They just played around with a disease that just killed people, but realized that that wouldn't work gameplay-wise. Then the Infected went through tons of changes in design and concept, practically throughout the entire development cycle, from what I know at least. So I think, at this point, when this storyboard was created, that the CBI and Infected were very loosely defined, and they weren't 100% sure where and how to use them. Thus, no mention on the board. Finally, overall, I think this version of The Last of Us could have been pretty cool to see. There are some cool things I wish we had, like more city-based locations for example. But it's noticeable how the game didn't really have its unique identity that made it so great in the first place, at this stage yet. There are the overly action-focused sections with rocket launchers and train rides. And then there is the unnecessary villain. They're trying too hard to make it dark by killing off all the side characters, etc. And if that was the version of The Last of Us we got, I'm not sure I'd be here making this video. Because as a fan, this, to me, is super cool to play around with, discuss, and make videos about. But in the end, it wasn't this version that made the game my favorite of all time. So if anything, this whole thing has made me appreciate the game that we got that much more. Anyways, thank you for watching, to everyone who made it through the series, as well as this video. And thank you to everyone who stuck with me during the seemingly endless production of this thing. Obviously, this was just my interpretation of the storyboard, but I hope you liked it nonetheless. I definitely want to do something like this again, when the opportunity arises. Maybe if something like this ever comes out for Left Behind. It has been an interesting challenge and project, but now it's time to move on to new stuff. What did you think about my attempt of reconstructing the storyboard, both in this video and the series overall? Do you agree or disagree with my discussion points? Be sure to tell me in the comments down below, and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a great day.